So the October Revolution of 1917 is ultimately going to result in Lenin emerging as this powerful Bolshevik leader. Lenin actually was still in Switzerland before the October Revolution began earlier in 1917, and the Germans actually arranged for Lenin to be returned to Russia. All right, so he's sent in a sealed railroad car to Russia again in April of 1917. Why do the Germans care? They actually think that if Lenin gets involved and tries to overthrow the German government, that he's going to cause trouble in Russia, and that's what the Germans want. All right, so what Lenin decides to do is say that he refuses to cooperate with the provisional government because it is too bourgeois. And instead, he argues that there needs to be a socialist revolution, and the result should be the establishment of a socialist republic. He argues that all banks and lands need to be nationalized, and some of the slogans that he repeats about the kind of tenets of this socialist revolution are all power to the Soviets, all land to the peasants, and stop the war now. And I believe it says all power to the Soviets on this stamp here. And these tenets of the revolution were called his April thesis. So the provisional government obviously wants to stop the Bolsheviks from moving against them, but the provisional government is unable to do so. All right. So so what you're going to see is that the Bolsheviks actually try to overthrow the provisional government a little bit too early, which is why I say premature Bolshevik coup. So at first, in April, when they try to overthrow the provisional government, they fail, and Lenin flees again to exile, this time to Finland. All right? And there are going to be some elections in the summer of 1917, which are going to result in the Bolsheviks achieving a majority, but it's a slim one. All right? But at the same time, the Bolsheviks feel like they have a little bit more leverage. Lenin also, even though he's in exile in Finland, is going to continue to try to direct the actions of the Bolsheviks from abroad. Okay, so how is the provisional government going to fall and leave room for the Bolsheviks to rise? Well, it actually comes from the complete opposite side of the political spectrum, and it is a result of the Kornilov affair. Okay, this is a conservative counter-coup measure. Okay, so people who are farther to the right than Kerensky also want his provisional government to fail. Okay, so these conservatives are plotting an overthrow of Kerensky's government. They're unhappy because they don't think that Kerensky is handling the war the right way. They're also unhappy because Kerensky has not been able to suppress the Bolsheviks. Also, they're really, really unhappy with the peasant seizures of land. Even though Kerensky didn't support the peasant seizures of land, they see that he was unable to successfully stop it, and that's what they're unhappy about. All right. However, the conservative counter-coup fails. And part of this is because, interestingly, even though the Bolsheviks want to overthrow the provisional government, they really don't want a conservative government to take over. So the Bolsheviks actually assist Kerensky in stopping the Kornilov affair, stopping the conservatives. However, even though the Kerensky government is temporarily saved due to the failure of the Kornilov affair, this is the provisional government itself is still going to be very weak because Kerensky is still determined not to end the war. Now, at this point, Russians were starving, they were desperate, they were experiencing really severe casualties during the war, and many of them wanted to end it, particularly, of course, the Bolsheviks. All right, so when Kerensky fails to end the war and also is not really preventing that peasant anarchy, the provisional government is going to fall. All right, so how is it literally overthrown? Leon Trotsky is responsible for this. He is leading the Red Army, and what he does is he successfully overthrows the provisional government and establishes the Soviet communist government. All right, so this happens on October 25th, 1917. All right, Trotsky is seen as the second most important figure behind the October Revolution, so right behind Lenin. All right, so when the Red Army is led into Petrograd, they overthrow the provisional government, and it collapses with very little bloodshed, all right, which makes many people celebrate the Russian Revolution, much less bloody than the February Revolution when the Tsar was forced to abdicate. The next day, October 26th, the Bolsheviks officially take control of the government, all right, so you're going to see the government officially become communist in nature. All right. What's interesting, most historians argue that what's even more significant is not so much that the Bolsheviks took control of the government, but that they maintained that control. So how do they do this? And one of the most important weapons they have is the establishment of a secret police, which was called the Cheka. Right, they're established later on in 1917 in December, and their idea, it's very much like the Reign of Terror in a sense, right? They're trying to eliminate opponents in any way possible. They become an organization that is very much feared. They have virtually absolute power, so they can do whatever they really want to try to repress the opposition. So, you know, this fear of retribution, if you go against the Bolsheviks, was enough to keep a lot of people from doing anything to stop them. You're going to have new elections for the Constituent Assembly in December of 1917 as well. All right, to attempt to get Bolsheviks to gain more representation in the Constituent Assembly. Lenin argues that the Bolsheviks represent peace, so the ending of Russian involvement in the First World War, land, so that peasants obviously will get more land, and bread, right? You know, to end the hunger and starvation that is pervasive in Russia. Now, despite this campaign, the Bolsheviks do not win the majority in the Constituent Assembly, so the Red Army takes things into their own hands. In January of 1918, the Red Army just overthrows this new government and replaces the government with more Bolshevik representatives. So essentially, they're destroying the democratically elected Constituent Assembly. Now, so many people are upset with this because they think it completely overthrows the democratic process, that this is going to be one of the major factors towards civil war. All right, at this point, we refer to the Bolsheviks as the Communist Party in Russia. Okay, next, what Lenin does when he's actually controlling the Communist Party in Russia. All right, first off, one thing that Kerensky refused to do, give land to the peasants. All right, the peasants had already taken a lot of the land in that anarchistic period before, but now Lenin is actually going to permit peasants from getting land from former lords. Right, now this is important and probably a wise move on Lenin's part, because the peasants would have taken the land anyway. So when he actually permits it, this makes it so that, of course, he's seen as a friend of the peasantry, and he's going to get a significant support from this huge part of the population. You're going to have nationalization of factories, right? Local workers are actually going to get direct control of these individual factories, so it's going to instill much more power just in the local working population. All right, and probably most importantly, Lenin takes Russia out of the First World War. We already discussed this treaty previously, but remember that the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March of 1918 establishes a separate peace with Germany before the whole war is over. Russia leaves the war. This is the territory that Russia concedes to Germany. So basically, you know, a lot of present-day Ukraine, Estonia. So, you know, it shows us that Russia was really desperate for peace because they lost a lot of land and also a significant population to Germany, albeit temporarily. Also, Lenin moves the capital from Petrograd or St. Petersburg to Moscow, and Trotsky works to reorganize the army. Now, a lot of people who were opposed to ending the war are going to get really upset by a lot of these reforms, opposed to ending the war, opposed to this, you know, redistribution of land. So we're going to see that this is also going to contribute to the Russian Civil War. All right, so the Russian Civil War happens in 1918 and continues for 2 years. All right, the two sides are the Reds, the Bolsheviks, who just took over the government, and the Whites. Okay, the Whites, you know, it's not just the Mensheviks, all right? The Whites are anyone who do not support the Bolsheviks. So anyone who supported the Tsar, anyone who was an officer of the old army before the army order number 1. All right, you know, also just groups that argue that they are the true government. They're all going to join the Whites. However, the Whites are not organized the same way that the Bolsheviks are. They don't have a true leader or anything. So this means that, you know, they automatically have a weakness compared to the Reds. All right. There are also going to be a lot of peasants that are scared of the whites, and so they decide to support the Reds. And also, peasants get much more out of the Bolshevik policies. They certainly get land, which is something that that a lot of peasants obviously support. What you're going to see is both sides are really brutal to try to win the conflict. You're going to see a huge exodus from Russia. Over 2 million people are actually going to flee Russia during the revolution and the Civil War. And you're also going to see Allied intervention. All right, so the Allies decide they want to do anything to stop the Bolsheviks from taking power. So the Allies end up sending troops in to help the whites, right? We talked about the Archangel expedition earlier, right? So they invade Russia, both in the north, and they're also going into Siberia. But ultimately, they do not do enough to stop the Reds. All right. Also, this is going to be something that the Russians never forget. They always remember that the Allies intervened in the Russian Civil War to try to stop the Bolsheviks. So in order to make sure that the Civil War was successful, the Bolsheviks enacted what's called war communism, which meant, again, it was sort of like a total war concept that was applied to all of Russia to make sure that the Reds won the Civil War. Okay, it was introduction of socialism for the first time in the Soviet Union, nationalization of all banks and industry. Everybody had to work, and everybody had to work for the war effort. So this made sure that the military always was supplied. The state's going to take control of heavy industries, and it's also going to stop private trade. All right, so you know, this is going to make it so that the military always gets supplies, but this is also going to make it so that general production and trade is going to decline significantly. Also, it's going to really rev up the actions of the Cheka, the secret police. All right, so they're going to hunt down and execute thousands of people that don't support the Bolsheviks. Most importantly, the Tsar and his family are going to be murdered by the Cheka. All right, so the Romanov family is going to be shot. Right, everyone, the Tsar, his wife, and his children. By 1921, you're going to see that the Reds end up winning the Russian Civil War. All right, now why did they win? Already discussed it a little bit, but again, they won primarily because they were more organized than the whites. Okay, Trotsky made sure that there was a draft instituted for the Reds, for the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. So there were always plenty of people able to fight for the Reds. All right. You're also going to see that anyone who tried to desert the Red Army would be shot. So, you know, there's a huge obvious incentive for people not to leave the Red Army. But the white leaders don't have that kind of organization. They don't have the draft. They don't have anyone like a figurehead leading the effort. So because the Reds win, in 1922 you have the establishment of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, or the USSR, all right? And overall, the result of the Russian Revolution. Most importantly, casualties. All right, among the war, the revolution, and the Civil War, 15 million Russians are killed. Many more end up leaving the country, emigrating elsewhere. You're going to see that the economy is at least temporarily ruined. Trade is going to be, international trade is going to be completely gone because of the nationalization of the economy during that war communism period. You're also going to see one of the most important legacies is that the end of the revolution, we see the establishment of the first communist society. So it's a monumental event of the 20th century, and of course significant ramifications for later in the 20th century when we get into the Cold War. So that's the Russian Revolution, and next we are going to talk about wrapping up the First World War.